Well, contrary to what people were saying about this, I'd say this has been living up to its name, because for the most part, it was pretty strange. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about the latest MCU movie, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content like more MCU reviews on a near-daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. This once again stars Benedict Cumberbatch as the title character, who teams up with a mysterious teenage girl from his dreams named America Chavez, played by Xochtil Gomez, who can travel across the multiverse to battle multiple threats, which threatens to wipe out millions. That's an abbreviated version of the official synopsis because part of it is just wrong and it's trying to mislead us, but by the time I'm getting to this review, you should know exactly how this goes down. This one is, of course, directed by Sam Raimi, who made his return to the big screen in nearly a decade after 2013's Oz the Great and Powerful, and initially this was going to be directed by Scott Derrickson, who helmed the first Doctor Strange, but due to creative differences, he left the project and in comes Sam Raimi. Now, I like Scott Derrickson. I liked what he did with the first Doctor Strange, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that my excitement for this shot through the roof upon hearing Sam Raimi was stepping in as director. I've seen almost all of his movies, and quite a few of them I love, and he's one of my all-time favorite directors. So anytime he's on board, especially since we haven't had a movie from him in so long, I'm immediately hyped. Plus, I was excited since it's the multiverse we're exploring, and given the endless possibilities we could possibly explore, as just evidenced earlier this year by the excellent Everything Everywhere All at Once, along with this film's title, I was anticipating quite a wild ride. On top of the fact that you have Elizabeth Olsen as Scarlet Witch in what appeared to be a much more villainous role than we've ever seen from her up until this point. And that really isn't so much of a spoiler, given there is that line in the trailer where she says,
"You break the rules. Look out!" I become a hero. I do it, and I become the enemy. It doesn't seem fair.
The advertising might not have officially said it, but it was pretty obvious. So it was going to be cool to see Wanda unleashed and going against the master of the mystic arts through the multiverse with Sam Raimi at the helm. Now, I try not to get myself overly hyped for every single Marvel project, especially because there have only been so many Phase 4 projects that I thought were great. But with everything I just listed, this shot up as one of my most anticipated movies of the year. And now that I've seen it, I'd say it mostly lives up to the hype. I had an absolute blast with this, and while it's not a perfect movie, and we're going to get into all that, I'd say as of now, this is up there as one of my favorite entries in the MCU. And I'll be upfront regarding the main reason why that is. Sam Raimi himself. While the script for this isn't flawless, Raimi's flair is a big reason why this is as enjoyable as it is. It's filled with all of his zoom-ins, crossfades, his campy sense of humor, and all of the horror imagery he became famous for. That's something I was especially curious about going in. I wasn't sure how much Raimi's influence was going to be over the final product, since, as much as I like the MCU as a whole, it is pretty obvious that with some exceptions, not all their movies have that distinct directorial flair to them. They'd feel like MCU movie first, and then the respective director's movie second. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. But this is just as much of a Sam Raimi movie as it is an MCU movie, and it's the first MCU horror movie we've ever gotten. Now, I don't think it's scary to the point you can't bring your kids or anything. I've heard a few people say that, and if you feel that way, then do what you feel is comfortable. But I think, while this does certainly tap well into horror territory, it's not to the point that I think kids can't handle it. I mean, there are movies that are rated PG in the 80s that have shown stuff that's just as bad, if not worse. Now, that being said, it's definitely the most violent of all the MCU movies. I mean, we're not talking an all-out gore fest or anything. I don't want to oversell it here. Like, there were talks about this if it should have been rated R, and I will firmly say, absolutely not. But, given how the violence in these movies is normally portrayed, This definitely pushes things a bit. There are a few nasty kills, and there's definitely a lot more blood compared to what we normally get. And some of those moments were a good bit of fun, especially in the over-the-top manner in which they're portrayed. Now, the big thing that many people have noted is that this feels like the film is split into two different types of movies. They say the first half feels a little more stylistically in the vein of your average MCU movie, while the second half is when it feels a lot more like a Sam Raimi movie. And to a degree, that's true. The movie starts off feeling a little like cookie cutter MCU, and it would have been cool to have seen just a little bit of that Sam Raimi style go all out right from the start. But I'd say his style isn't totally absent from the first half, as some of the fights, as mentioned, are pretty bloody, even if nothing too out there or anything. And honestly, once we get the reveal pretty early on that Wanda is our villain, this starts going all out a lot more in terms of the Raimiisms, and that's pretty early on. A lot of people seem to indicate it's not till a little later in the movie, but I think once we got the reveal, which isn't too long in, that's where it kicked in. And from there, it gets increasingly more Raimi and less MCU as it goes on. There's especially a scene involving a mirror early on that I thought was just so much fun, and it felt like it could have been something right out of The Evil Dead.
Groovy.
And regarding whether or not it actually lives up to the madness part of its title, that's one of those things that's going to come down to your expectations. Because admittedly, you only spend a considerable amount of time in like a handful of worlds. We get one sequence in the beginning where Strange and America Chavez fly through the multiverse and they briefly go through Block World, Paint World, Cartoon World, and all these other worlds in the span of like 30 seconds. But then they're mainly in the Illuminati universe afterwards, which isn't a spoiler as that was mentioned in one of the TV spots, and they don't move through too much in the multiverse beyond that. And I know in the lead up to this, there were a lot of rumors about what would entail, like how much time in other universes would we spend, who would cameo in the movie, how much of a Doctor Strange film would this be, and how much of an event film would this be like. Like, the way this was getting hyped up, it was being treated as like another Infinity War or Endgame, just with the multiverse. And I get where that's coming from, as Spider-Man No Way Home was the most recent MCU movie before this, and that was essentially an event-like movie dealing with the multiverse, with all these previous villains and heroes playing a big part. And the way this was being described, it was being called bonkers and full of surprises. So I get it if a lot of people thought this was going to be more in that Infinity War / Endgame vein. Well, it's not. The only major cameos are in the Illuminati world, as well as the usual post-credit scenes, along with a very funny Bruce Campbell cameo that pays homage nicely to The Evil Dead that I absolutely loved. And as I said, the action is restricted to only a few worlds, so if you were expecting Infinity War, Endgame, No Way Home level, then yeah, you're going to be disappointed. But if you're a Sam Raimi fan, like I am, that's where the Multiverse of Madness part comes from. Because when you start getting things like Zombie Strange, the Book of Ashanti, dark magic, and some bloody horror violence, that definitely feels like madness to me. Maybe not so much with the multiverse hopping, but it still feels like a lot is thrown at us. And like I said, it's all a blast. This feels like the Sam Raimi we last saw in Drag Me to Hell, rather than the Sam Raimi who's made safer studio projects in the 90s and 2000s. And I do like a lot of his studio projects, like his first two Spider-Man movies are some of my favorite comic book movies of all time, if not some of my favorite movies of all time. But if I had to choose between Studio Raimi and Evil Dead Drag Me to Hell Raimi, I'm typically going to choose the latter. And it's also worth noting, Danny Elfman's score here is out of this world. I generally don't have much to say regarding film scores and non-musicals, so I rarely bring them up in reviews, but this was one of my favorite scores in a movie this year. Elfman's compositions, combined with Raimi doing his usual crossfades and zoom-ins, really added a lot of tension and would feel so engaging in so many sequences. There are even times where, if it wasn't for their combined efforts, the scene itself would have just felt lackluster. Like, there's one scene in which we get like this minute-long exposition dump that is an important moment, but it's just characters sitting there talking to each other. And in any other pair's hands, this would have been a sort of stale movie moment. But with the way Elfman's booming score, with his guitar riff kicking in, along with Raimi doing his thing, the way they go together, it makes the scene one of the most well-done moments in the entire movie, and puts it on a whole other level. But of course, as much as I'd love to gush about Sam Raimi all day, this is still an MCU movie as well, and most importantly, a Doctor Strange movie, so we have to talk about all that. So as usual, Benedict Cumberbatch is excellent as Strange, and here, he actually gets much more of a compelling arc than I think we got for him in the first movie. While I liked him in the first film, I did note that while he did gain some perspective, he wasn't exactly this humble, changed man by the end of the movie. he still remained this arrogant doctor we met at the beginning of the movie, who now just also happened to be versed in the mystic arts. This sees him have to grapple with a few things. Not only is he still bringing into question if all the choices he made through some of the other MCU movies are the right ones, but he also has to deal with not getting to be with the love of his life, Christine Palmer, played again by Rachel McAdams, who gets considerably more to do this time around, especially as she also plays a variant of Palmer. And he gets told early on how he's always had to hold the knife. He always had to be in control, which is true. We've seen it in all of his MCU appearances where, similar to Tony Stark, he always has to be the one in control. Like, if you look at Infinity War and Endgame, he risked the fate of the universe based on looking at a bunch of different outcomes and only seeing one possibility where they beat Thanos, which involved him and half the world also getting dusted for 5 years. And he didn't consult anyone on that. He didn't give any other options. He just made the call, and while it worked, it was obviously still a big risk. So throughout this film, we see him grapple with having to learn that need to always be in the control comes at a cost. And in this case, it cost him the love of his life. And we see him come to terms with that. And unlike a number of his other MCU appearances, he actually grows this time. Though, to be clear, he was always a cool character in all of his other appearances. This is just worth pointing out. But this is as much of a movie about Wanda as it is about Strange, with this more or less being a direct sequel to WandaVision as it is to Doctor Strange. When we first see Wanda here, she's still dealing with a lot of the emotional fallout from the events of that series, and her actions in this film are a direct result of her trying to process the grief she's feeling. And Elizabeth Olsen is just excellent here. While I like Cumberbatch a lot, Olsen is the big scene stealer. With her shifting to be the movie's antagonist, she easily brings us one of the most compelling villains in the entire MCU, especially as she's someone who we previously rooted for. But here, she has a very sympathetic plight that she just channels into something much more sinister, especially as we see she's been corrupted by this Darkhold. And it makes us feel bad for her and want her to be able to achieve some happiness, though just not through the means she's attempting, which is basically kill America Chavez and steal her powers. And because of all those extra layers and depth, it makes her a refreshing MCU villain, which to this day still continues to be a pretty hit and miss thing for them, as the MCU has been known for having some pretty underwhelming villains. But Olsen's performance is one part powerful and at other times scene-chewing without being cartoonish, because as she continues to lose her mind as things go on, it allows her to let loose and have some fun, and that's also in part thanks to Raimi playing into the film's more over-the-top elements, but at the same time, she gets to still play nicely into the more tragic elements of Wanda's story. Now, a common criticism I have heard regarding her specifically is that this doesn't track compared to where we saw her last in WandaVision. Like, this is a complete 180 for her character, and I would have to disagree with that, because if you watch the end of that show, then you'll see Wanda is already trying to figure out how to get her kids back, and you see her clearly tapping into that dark magic that's trying to corrupt her. So this is believable as the next step for this character, and it brings her arc full circle since her introduction as someone who's lost it all from essentially the get-go and has now reached her breaking point in the worst way possible. While there are those who really like the character to a point where it's hard for them to see this, it's still a believable next step for her. And at 2 hours and 6 minutes, making it one of the shortest MCU movies in quite some time, it moves at such a breakneck speed. Like, this wastes absolutely no time. It thrusts us right into the middle of things, and it gets us right into the main plot within minutes. Lately, with some of these MCU movies, or really any other major blockbuster that runs at well over 2 hours, it does take a good bit of time to set things up before the main events kick off. But here, we get the reveal early on, and the chase through the multiverse begins not even a half hour in. Maybe not even 20 minutes in, though I could be wrong there. And from there, it's a giant cat and mouse chase full of exciting action, horror, and some fun character moments. I'm glad that we got a big movie like this that wasted no time and got right to the point. And it made this movie fly by, especially with all the Raimi-isms thrown in there. And I don't think every superhero movie needs to be these 2.5 hour, 3 hour long event films in order to feel compelling or emotionally satisfying. I know a lot of blockbusters have been moving towards being in that ballpark time frame, but I don't think it's always necessary. There are plenty of great movies that are 90 minutes to 2 hours, and they're fine the way they are. Now, that all being said, it is worth noting this script doesn't always feel the smoothest, and there are times where the desire to move at such a rapid fire pace does cause it to sometimes feel light on moments where characters should just take a beat to soak everything in, whatever it is that just happened. And I'm not saying this is a film totally devoid of any and all emotion, like I just got through saying how Strange and Wanda have these big emotional arcs, and I really wouldn't have added much else to the story to stretch things out longer than they needed to be. It's just there are things I wished were explored just a little better, like how Strange makes this offhand comment how Trudeau Ejiofor's Mordo has been trying to kill him since the events of the first movie, and we never got anything showing that here. But I think for the most part, the structure of the story itself was fine as it is. It's just there are times where it would have been nice to spend even just like an extra minute with a scene, just to be able to give these characters some breathing room, whether it be for them to just take in what just happened and actually react to it, or let the tension play out for just a touch longer, or at least to add in an extra line of dialogue here and there between some of the conversation, because some exchanges did feel a tad clunky. And this probably would have been felt even more had this been directed by someone other than Raimi, since, as I mentioned earlier, his flair made some exposition-heavy sequences feel even more interesting than they were written. On top of that, I also would have liked had America Chavez just get a little more to do. Not that she feels totally one-dimensional or anything, and Xochtil Gomez gave a great performance. However, she serves as a huge part of the story since Wanda is trying to get to her, and she does open this huge door, quite literally, to the multiverse. Yet she definitely feels more like a MacGuffin. While they are clearly setting up an arc for her as we find out she's trying to find her parents, that ultimately has nothing to do with the overall story of this film. The most we get with her is exploring just a little bit regarding how to control her powers, which is only summed up in so many lines, and I think that's just a specific moment that plays into the script issues that I mentioned earlier. I mean, I know it's not called America Chavez in the Multiverse of Madness or anything, and I'm sure we're going to explore a lot more with her in future films, but I think for someone who was integral to the story as she was, I think they could have just added like a few more little beats for her here and there, and it would have been a big improvement. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness doesn't feel like your average MCU movie, and depending on what you want in your superhero movies these days, that'll either be a good or a bad thing. If you prefer the MCU sticking to their well-known formula and playing things mostly safe outside of getting a cameo fest, then you might not be disappointed in this. But if you're looking for the MCU to finally take some risks, you definitely get that here, thanks to Sam Raimi injecting a lot of his visual flair and heightening some otherwise clunkier moments in the script. And that's where the real madness comes into play, as we get our first MCU horror movie. Now, while this has proven to be one of the more divisive entries in this franchise, I hope we get more risks like this in the MCU, as this was easily a highlight of this series for me. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness gets an 8.5 out of 10. So let me know, did you see Doctor Strange 2, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you like him more than the first Doctor Strange, less than the first Doctor Strange? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.